The recording gives us the first tangible sense of what it was like for these American government workers in Havana who were hearing these unexplained sounds in their residences and later developed physical symptoms. Americans who heard these sounds in Havana have described slightly different sounds, and even in some of the recordings that the AP has reviewed, there are slight variations. However, this high-pitched cricket sound seems to appear in all of them. The U.S. Embassy in Havana has played these recordings for Americans who are working there so they know what to listen to. These recordings have also been reviewed by people who heard the sounds firsthand in Cuba, and they confirm that the recordings are generally consistent with what they heard. We still don't know what is causing the sound, and the recordings don't appear to have significantly furthered the investigation. Even with the recordings being analyzed, the U.S. government still says it has been unable to determine what is causing the sound.
You won't be hearing it, but of course it is going into your system. It's like a, acoustic hammer which is hitting you. You're just not able to hear it because its frequency is much higher. So there were some concerns to it, and if it is really, really high, it could create some, what we call as a bioeffects.
It's possible that what we're hearing on the recording is actually only part of the picture. Traditional recording devices are only able to pick up certain types of frequencies, such as the ones that the human ear can hear. It's possible there are additional frequencies, possibly those too low or too high to be picked up, that are also happening when these attacks occur.
Scientists are pointing their fingers at Cold War-era microwave weapons for the illnesses of more than 36 American diplomats and family members in Cuba and China. The baffling symptoms, first reported as possible sonic attacks, began in late 2016. We want to play you a bit of a sample of what they heard. Listen. Now, Dr. Mark Siegel, Fox News medical correspondent, is here to tell us more. So that sounds like just like kind of a small thing, but this was being done over time, and it had a real impact on folks.
Absolutely. More than 36 diplomats were involved in both Cuba and China since 2016, and President Trump had to pull them out of there. And actually, at first it was thought to be sonic weapons. Now, that would affect the inner ear, part of the inner ear near the brain, and it would cause a sudden onset of symptoms. That's the key here. That's how we know it's not a virus, it's not a poisoning, it doesn't sound like hysteria. It's just a sudden onset of symptoms. And it would cause a problem with balance, with dizziness, nausea, vomiting, which is what happened. And then later on, there could be some brain damage as well as loss of hearing. That's what we thought. Now, scientist Doug Smith from the University of Pennsylvania is coming out and saying, well, maybe it's microwaves. And microwaves are very interesting because Dr. Frey has studied that for many years, and the Russians know about this, and Putin knows about this. And what happens is microwaves damage the temporal lobe of the brain and influence not only hearing, not only balance, but also behavior and
Very
brain
serious.
damage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's very
serious
serious.
Stuff.
Could be either way. It could be either way at this point, but definitely something like either sound waves or radio waves.
All right,
On this episode of China Uncensored, this advanced technology could secretly make you sick, and the whole time you'd have no idea what's going on. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your... Wait, do you hear that? It's like some kind of subtle and vague but abnormal sensations of sound and pressure.
We got a health alert basically saying, and I can read you part of it, that a U.S. government employee in China recently reported subtle and vague but abnormal sensations of sound and pressure.
Wow! Are they sure it wasn't just from watching CNN? On Wednesday, an embassy spokesperson reported that an employee in the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou experienced a variety of physical symptoms between late 2017 and April 2018. The employee was sent back to the United States and diagnosed with a mild traumatic brain injury. This statement from the embassy warns, while in China, if you experience any unusual acute auditory or sensory phenomena accompanied by unusual sounds or piercing noises, do not attempt to locate their source. Instead, move to a location where the sounds are not present. Which sounds really creepy, especially since it's consistent with what's called a sonic attack. And no, that's not the newest burger from Sonic. A sonic attack uses weaponized frequencies that can't be heard clearly by the human ear, but can trigger very real physical responses. The BBC says some of the symptoms include vertigo, vomiting, or uncontrollable defecation, which is also a symptom of your late-night sonic attack. According to the U.S. Secretary of State, what happened to the U.S. diplomat in China is medically similar to what happened to U.S. diplomats in Cuba back in 2016.
We had an incident in Guangzhou that was that the medical indications are very similar and entirely consistent with the medical indications that have taken place to Americans working in Cuba.
If you're curious, Gizmodo has uploaded that sound, which seems like an incredibly bad idea, but hey, it's the internet. Let's take a listen. Yeah, it's definitely Yanni. What's that, Shelley? What do you mean it's Laurel?
Imagine a CSI investigation, this famous TV program, where the investigators don't have the murder weapon, don't have the place, don't have access to the victims. How the hell you investigate that? It's impossible. So you're gonna
Late 2016, Havana.
Dr. Rosenfarb, are you aware of any type of technology that would cause this?
No, I'm not, sir.
American diplomats were complaining of crushing headaches, extreme fatigue,
Who would do this?
and an intense
Secretary Tillerson
sound.
ordered the departure of non-emergency personnel from post.
The Cubans, they said they knew nothing about it.
Sporadic attack continued until late April.
But that sound is why this building is nearly empty at this important moment for Cuba. For the first time in 60 years, its leader will not be a Castro.
Two things we know for sure.
Here's what the U.S. government has said about the sound.
People were hurt, and the Cuban government knows who did it. Whatever happened to these people happened as a result of some sophisticated technology that, quite frankly, is so sophisticated we don't understand it. It leads you then, so you have a sophisticated...
In Washington, Senator Marco Rubio convened a hearing.
Was the early opinion of the security professionals who looked at it that it was likely a form of harassment.
Okay. In late 2016, staff at the United States Embassy in Havana began complaining of strange noises, and among the descriptions that they complained of, high-pitched beam of sound or just intense pressure in one ear. There are 24 Americans who during their time in Havana have experienced symptoms that are consistent with what you would see in mild traumatic brain injury and or concussion.
Doctors said that diplomats' brain matter had actually changed. What started out as a mysterious nuisance
It happened to 24 people.
became a suspected instrument of attack.
Tillerson reacted as he would have reacted when he was an oil executive. He heard something happen in an oil rig, get everybody out of there.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson ordered his staff.
We are convinced these were targeted attacks. We don't like our diplomats being targeted.
Depart your post, he said. Leave Cuba. And they did. Everyone from the people who discussed trade down to those who processed visas. The incident had become political.
Se están utilizando estos daños de salud como pretexto de naturaleza política, con objetivos políticos, para eliminar los progresos alcanzados y dañar la relación bilateral.
This is entirely about the health and the safety and the well-being of Americans. We still have an investigation that's underway. So I hope Cuba would focus instead on helping us with the investigation and be less concerned about claiming this is political.
The contrast which is very...
Carlos Azugaray was a Cuban diplomat for decades. He's a bit of an unofficial government spokesperson.
Why draw down the embassy? The bad thing about it is that probably the guys who have been affected more are the regular Cubans, not the government.
By the time the diplomats left, the warming started by President Obama had undeniably chilled. The U.S. issued a travel advisory and tourism dropped. On the streets of Havana, the idea that Cuba was involved in a sonic attack was met with skepticism.
Vayamos por algo bien bizarro, y si es bien bizarro, lo crees, es la historia, ¿no?
Lo de los ataques sónicos es un invento. Es un invento mediático y yo considero que es una histeria.
Mira, si nosotros tuviéramos el desarrollo tecnológico a ese nivel, de hacer este ataque masivo y tan sutil lo emplearíamos en criar alimentos para el pueblo y en otras. Es algo ridículo lo que plantea.
It wasn't long after the incident became public that sound experts began downplaying the idea of a sonic attack. Sound can't easily change brain matter, among other reasons.
You've got a long, long way to go before you even attribute this to sound. It's not going to cause physical effects. If the sound goes through air before reaching you, it's not going to cause that. As I said, you can...
It may have been a situation where people were drawn more closely together.
It wasn't only the sound experts who struggled to explain what happened.
Infectious cause is what I would say.
Engineers also tried.
It could have just been a malfunctioning ultrasonic device, perhaps used for some other nefarious purpose.
And psychologists.
Well, these people were on an island. Fears can spread in a tight group. Things can get more intensified. Anything is possible.
A microwave expert.
If you direct a beam of microwave, the microwave would produce an acoustic wave.
This doctor said it could have just been a virus.
An infection of some type.
So an ultrasonic weapon is not science fiction. I could build one, I could put it in the house of somebody I didn't like, and I could annoy them. What it's really seems science fiction is the idea you could build an ultrasonic rifle that'll shoot 100 meters and target somebody and shoot through a wall and get just that one person.
Dr. Layton is referring to this hotel, where some diplomats reported hearing the sound. Look up. It's unlikely you could direct a weaponized sound wave across this street, 11 stories up, through walls and windows, and hit individuals repeatedly without anyone noticing.
No se encontró huella de persona en los alrededores de la residencia. No se encontró rastro, pues se utilizó la técnica canina.
The U.S. wouldn't share any evidence of an attack with the Cubans.
The administration's reaction to all of this is so drastic to make permanent the drawdown of the U.S. Embassy to ridiculously low, unnecessary levels, which has an element of spite to it.
Fulton Armstrong is a former CIA analyst who covered Cuba. He made a career out of searching for motives.
They were so desperate to make their case that it was sonic attacks. This is serious stuff. You're accusing them of doing line-of-sight attacks with a weapon that no one knows exists. So that once the political people got stuck in their own internal contradictions, it was almost impossible then to get a real serious discussion of what was going on. The administration had already decided it was going to use it, the legitimate symptoms of U.S. government officials, for a political maneuver that looks like a lot of other political things that this administration has done, and that is, at any cost, undo what the predecessor did.
There are a number of people in the administration and some in Congress who didn't want to see normalization of relations. So for those who didn't like the policy changes by President Obama's administration, it's worked out pretty well.
You have the State Department where practically all the major executive jobs have not been covered. It's the perfect situation for someone like Marco Rubio to hijack a policy and push.
And so it leads you to conclude that the Cuban government either did this or they know who did it. And they can't say because whoever...
Marco Rubio got his way. Sometimes in U.S. politics, the strongest voice is the voice that predominates even when the bureaucracy isn't with you.
That whoever did this
the bureaucracy has allowed the political voice to come in and dictate a lot, including analysis of the so-called sonic attacks issue.
And then it leads you down the road of motivation. It makes you start to think, who would do this? Who would do this? Someone who doesn't like our presence there and someone who wants there to be this sort of friction between the U.S. So who would be motivated to create friction, or who would not be in favor of an increased U.S. presence in Cuba?
We don't want to be in this position. We have no choice. We cannot send Americans in the Foreign Service and their relatives to a country where their safety cannot be guaranteed.
Senator Rubio, a son of Cuban exiles, has been a longtime critic of the Castro government. he's always been an opponent of reestablishing ties with Cuba.
Now, I'm not under any fantasy that Cuba's going to transition from one day to the next and turn into Canada, but there has to be progress in that direction, and there's never been a step in that direction. To the extent that they've taken these steps, they've been largely cosmetic, and they've retreated from some of those positions. So who would be motivated to create friction, or who would not be in favor of an increased U.S. presence? Maybe it was a third country. Which third country would want to disrupt the U.S. presence there? And the logical conclusion is Russia and Vladimir Putin.
Has the State Department raised attacks against U.S. personnel in Cuba with the Russian government?
That's a very good question. I think it would be better to address that issue in a classified setting.
Why would the fact or lack of existence of a communication to the Russian government be something that we can't discuss in public?
To give you the full reply would be required, and I believe that would be more appropriate in the classified setting.
Has Raul Castro ever said to any U.S. diplomat, I didn't do it, but it's possible that some of my guys did it without me knowing about it?
I do not believe that communication has ever occurred.
You don't want to discuss something that is not in the proper setting, or is that just you just have never heard that?
That is my recollection, that I've never heard that.
Okay. The meeting is adjourned.
The U.S. has still not given an official explanation of the sound, or its intent, if any, but its effect has been to play a big part in the current disengagement with Cuba. This is happening at a pivotal moment. Raul Castro is stepping down, and Miguel Diaz-Canel will likely be president.
The notion that we have just a skeletal staff at the embassy, fewer people than we had during, the time of isolation, is just unconscionable.
Well, the transition's not, it's a one-party transition. The outcome's not in doubt. You would love to see a new generation of leadership that begins to move in the right direction, and I think those moves would be reciprocated by American policymakers. But it's not going to happen because of a unilateral American opening. That was the flawed thinking behind an opening towards China, and China today is no more democratic and no more free than it was, and that was not the experience in the aftermath of the Obama opening. It did not lead to any changes in governance or in the economic condition of Cubans in the big picture.
After more than 5 very difficult decades, the relationship between our governments will not be transformed overnight. We continue as President Castro.
What are we doing? We're pulling out of the game. They would prefer to buy American rice and American chicken. They would prefer to have Americans come down and do travel in Cuba. They like us, but if we're going to treat them in the way that we're treating them, they will make their own future without us. They say they've been making their future for the last 60 years without us, and they're prepared to do it, perhaps with some hyperbole, for another 60 years.
We move now to a mystery developing in China. A U.S. government employee may have been the victim of a sonic attack, much like the attacks on American diplomats in Cuba. It comes at a very sensitive time as the Chinese bulk up their military in the South China Sea. David Martin has details on this.
An American working at the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou had to be sent home in April after feeling abnormal sensations of sound and pressure over a period of months. Last week, medical tests concluded his symptoms matched those of mild traumatic brain injury. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it a serious medical incident and explained why.
The medical indications are very similar and entirely consistent with the medical indications that have taken place to Americans working in Cuba.
Last year, more than 20 Americans at the U.S. Embassy in Havana suffered ailments including hearing loss and nausea after being exposed to this high-pitched sound. One theory is that it was a surveillance device directed by local security forces against Americans suspected of working for U.S. intelligence. This afternoon, Pompeo met with China's foreign minister, who said it is investigating and hasn't found anybody who could have been responsible for the sonic attacks. Pompeo said the U.S. is conducting its own investigation.
We have medical teams that are moving to be on the ground there. We are working to figure out what took place both in Havana and now in China.
The U.S. Embassy and all 5 consulates in China have held town hall meetings to give employees a chance to ask questions about the threat posed by sonic attacks. Jeff?
David Martin at the Pentagon. David, thanks.
We just don't have the definitive answers yet. We consider these to be incidents because we still are trying to determine the actual cause.
New details on a series of bizarre attacks. Dozens of unexplained illnesses, including head injuries, forced the U.S. to bring home diplomatic staff from China and the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Speculation at the time was that it was some sort of sonic attack. But now the scientist who led the investigation tells the New York Times the main culprit is likely some kind of microwave weapon. CNN's Patrick Ottman is following the story from Havana. So, Patrick, what happened at the U.S. Embassy that led authorities to suspect that it was indeed an attack? And now we're talking about these, a microwave weapon.
It's still very much a diplomatic mystery, but let me walk you through what is a very complicated case. It all began November 2016, right after the U.S. presidential election, and that is when U.S. diplomats based here in Havana said they begin to experience these really strange symptoms, often at night, sometimes while they're in bed, asleep in their homes or their hotel rooms here in Cuba, and they said that they would feel nausea, hear loud sounds, hearing loss, but if they got up out of bed, if they left the room where they were in, it would stop. If they walked back into where they had felt this incident, this attack as they described it, it would start again. So they felt that they were being targeted with some sort of mysterious beam of energy. Initially, they complained to Cuban authorities about what they felt they were being targeted with sonic weapons, and these are weapons that do exist, usually used for crowd control. But experts consulted by CNN at the time, said that sonic weapons really don't work like that. They don't usually cause someone to hear a noise, and they're much too large to be used in this capacity. Now we have scientists that have met and helped treat some of those diplomats coming out and saying that perhaps it's a microwave weapon. This is also a weapon, but much more portable, that shoots a beam of energy, and it can be pinpointed in the way these diplomats described both here in Cuba and in China, and that it can actually cause people to think they're hearing sounds, but this is just a symptom of this beam of energy that's being directed at people, and it can cause these kinds of symptoms. One of the researchers told CNN it causes concussion without actually causing a concussion, the immaculate concussion, they said. So again, we don't know very little bit about these weapons because so few countries use them. Cuban authorities say there's no evidence, though, that the diplomats were ever targeted here. They have called on the U.S. to release more information about this. So right now, it may be one piece of still a very big puzzle, Fred.
It is mysterious, but, there are a couple things from that reporting, that there is some place of blame, or at least looking seriously at Russia. And then the other is, it's not just a very disturbing high-pitched noise, but there might even be voices or a message, a continual message that people have been victimized by, you know, this sound, that, you know, there's this kind of messaging coming from it. What more do we know about that, or who is adding any credence to that?
There are a number of... It's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
There are a number of countries, including the former Soviet Union and now Russia, that have microwave weapon programs going back decades. There's some evidence that they've been used in other countries against U.S. diplomats, that this was a very active program the USSR had. Again, still no evidence that they were used here, hard evidence they're used in Cuba, but it seems to fit the scenario. Now, the Cuban officials here said we would never allow this to be used, but of course, in a country like Cuba, it's impossible to imagine that a third actor could come in and use these weapons without the Cuban officials knowing. They have allowed the FBI to come in. They have allowed Canadian investigators, because there's some Canadian diplomats that have complained of similar symptoms, and they've turned up nothing. But in a way, you read about these weapons and these weapons programs that did exist, and it's kind of the perfect weapon because it leaves no trace.